Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. Today, I am joined by grief recovery specialist Rachel Gwilym. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here, Tara.
It's lovely to meet you, Rachel. And I know we had a great chat on the phone. So I know that this is going to be a lovely conversation. And I came across the grief recovery method a year or two ago, and I'm really fascinated by it. I'd love to do it myself, train in the method. And so firstly, I'm curious, how did you come to training in it?
Well, it's been one of those long journeys. So I started out as a children's nurse at Great Ormond Street, and I was a very naive 18-year-old and shocked really to discover children dying. And that was the beginning really of a long journey with death and grief. So I completed my training at Great Ormond Street, and then I specialised in oncology and worked on the children's oncology unit for a while, and really feeling that the Western medical model didn't speak to children's spiritual needs. I was interested then, but spiritual emotional needs. So I went back to university and studied African and Asian medical related studies and theology, and sort of then took a different route and ended up in Ethiopia looking at the healing traditions, which was a very different journey. And so it's been more recently that I've come back to working with grief specifically. I've trained as a funeral celebrant, and on the back of that, I was running death cafes. And the people who were coming to the death cafes were really interested in me offering some kind of sessions on how to support grieving friends. And I was really keen to do that, but I thought I don't have the right tools. So I went to the internet and I came across the grief recovery method, and it so spoke to my heart as a technique, as a really heartfelt, but also scientifically backed up methodology. And because I'd had the experience of working with children, I really saw how this method could have served them. And so I just jumped straight in and began my training. And it coincided with a very profound loss in my own life. And so I ended up having trained, then working with a colleague, processing an utterly devastating loss, and really experiencing the power of the method for myself. So I've come out of that period of time with a real passion for the grief recovery method. I see that it's worked in my own life. I see that it could have worked with the families that I used to work with in the past, and I see it working with my clients now. So yeah, so I feel as if it's an ongoing journey. As grief recovery specialists, we commit to doing ongoing, and that's very, very important to me. And it's a very freeing process. I feel quite liberated doing this work.
I really love that commitment, because I too, feel like I'm always learning and, bringing in new skills and new ways to support people and support ourselves too, because we're always in a process of healing in life as human beings, aren't we? Yeah.
Yes. And I think one of the gifts of the grief recovery method is that we come as grievers. It's part of our human condition. We can't not grieve. And so to share a method that works for us as therapists, if I use that term, we're not in a position of authority, or just that we have a toolkit that has worked for us and we know it works for others, and we can share it with those who want to learn.
So I was thinking, I know this is sort of like a big question, but, a bit more in a synopsis of how does it work? How does it perhaps different from other groups or modalities?
Well, I guess the most important thing is that it's an action toolkit. And so it's not just talking about your feelings about grief, and that has its place. But this is a process of 7 to 8 weeks, depending if you're working one-to-one or in a group. So it's a time limited process. So you know at the outset how long it's going to take to learn these steps. And the steps are really intended to allow you to connect with your heart. Because, you know, we can all say things intellectually, you know, and there's lots of phrases that we hear within our culture. Like if someone has died, we might say, well, they're not suffering now, or they had a long life. And you can know that in your mind, but your heart still hurts. Your heart still longs for them. And so the grief recovery method is really to allow you to drop into the heart and to look at what it is you're actually feeling, and then take the steps to. So firstly, you're finding out what the loss is that you've experienced and how it's impacting you, and the behaviors that perhaps you're using to keep the feelings at bay. You know, we might go shopping every day. Sometimes we call it retail therapy, but it's really just keeping the feelings at bay. It's not actually processing the emotional heart of it. So we begin by looking at the myths that we have around grief and loss, looking at the behaviors that we might be manifesting as a consequence of loss, and then just beginning to look at our history of loss, and then look at our relationship with the individual within which that we've experienced the loss. And, you know, it could be divorce, it could be death, it could be the loss of trust or the loss of safety, it could be moving house. You know, there's lots and lots of different types of loss. So the grief recovery method allows for grief to arise in relation to any loss. So you step through these processes, and then you come to look very specifically at the relationship within which the loss has occurred. And that really gets you to the heart of what's been left uncommunicated. That's really what the heart of grief is. It's what the heart of incomplete grief is. It's the things that haven't been communicated, those emotional statements, those feelings that haven't been expressed. And then the next step is to find a way to express them. So in this step, we're really looking at what it is that's incomplete. And it could be that something needs to be forgiven. It could be that an apology needs to be made, or it could be something else, just an expression of hope, maybe that you'd hoped that you would do something together, or, you know, an expression of a significant emotional statement. That's the phrase we use, a significant emotional statement. So the final stage, bringing that incomplete grief to completion, is writing all those things down and saying it out loud. And it's on the one hand, it's very, very simple. And on the other hand, it's very powerful. And, you know, because I've gone through it with so many people now, I see each time the power of it, both the combination of the simplicity and the power. It's not something difficult to learn to do. It's just being willing to drop into the heart.
Mm. And so when people write it down, do they sort of write a letter to their person, or just sort of write it down and then read it back to you?
Yeah, so we do it. We do it in a number of steps. So you begin by writing a graph down. So just looking at the relationship from its inception to the present moment, looking at the highs and lows of that relationship. And then the next step is to break that graph down into these what we call the 3 recovery components, those things that you want to say sorry for, those things that you need to forgive, and any other significant emotional statements. So then you break them down, and each week you bring back your homework, so to speak, and share it with the person you're working with. And the person you could do this, you could follow this method using the handbook, or you could work with a specialist like me. So each week you bring back the work that you've done, and most weeks it involves some writing. So it will be the loss history graph, then your recovery components, and then you write a letter. And in the letter, what you're doing is you're weaving together all your recovery components. And the final step of the grief recovery method is to share that letter. And you would never share it with the person that you've written it to, even if they're still living, you know, because you can imagine if you've said something like, I forgive you for being so nasty to me when we were on holiday, da, da, da. In a way, that's an accusation, you know, and it could trigger a defensive response.
Right.
So this is your communication. This is what you want to be heard. And you bring it to the person you're working with, whether that's a friend or a specialist, and they offer you that space. And in a way, you know, I often feel it's like a sacred space, really, that you open that heart space to hear this individual's heartfelt, emotional statements, you know, their letter to the person that they're grieving, or the person with whom there's grief. And you, the grief recovery specialist acts as a heart with ears. That's the phrase that we use. And I think it really sums it up beautifully, that we offer this space, and to be heard by a living person is really remarkably healing. And so those communications have been made. You know, you've got in touch with what it is that's incomplete. You found a way of expressing it, and then you've expressed it to someone who's living. And that's the journey towards completion.
Amazing, amazing. And I was thinking, one of the things that I really love about the method is how it encompasses all griefs, and bringing that awareness to people that grief is not just the death of somebody. It's so much more than that. And often we don't make the time and the space to honor these feelings, and, you know, which are so complicated, and there's so many of them. And I know when we spoke, we really tapped into having the sort of conflicting feelings, which is a big thing, isn't it? So I was wondering if you would be willing to share a little bit more about what we mean by conflicting feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, in a way, that's one definition of grief, the conflicting feelings that arise as a consequence of loss. So an example of conflicted feelings could be with someone perhaps who has died after a long illness. You could say, well, I'm relieved their suffering is over. But you could also say, I'm angry with them for leaving me. Or you could also feel, I'm so sad they had to go. Or you could feel anger at the doctor who didn't diagnose them properly. You know, and so you've got this jumble of feelings, and it can feel so jangling. And then you can feel guilty, you know, because you're angry with someone for dying. And that doesn't seem fair. You know, your head says that's not fair. They had no choice. So with the grief recovery method, we just gently tease those emotions apart. So then as you're putting together your recovery components, there's space to say, I'm sorry. You can say, I'm sorry that I feel angry. Or you could just say, let's think. So say you've been widowed and your life partner has died. You could say, when I get up in the morning and you're not there, I feel angry, and I forgive you for leaving me. And then your next statement could be, when I feel angry that you're not there, I want you to know that I still love you, and I'm sorry that I'm feeling angry. And you know, you can see that as you tease out even that one sort of novel of conflicting feelings, you can just feel the spaciousness arise, because as you begin to allow yourself to know that you feel angry, that's such an important first step. And that it's okay to feel angry. It's quite normal to feel angry in these situations. You know, you're not someone bad. You're not thinking badly of the person that you've lost. You're in touch with what you're feeling, and you're feeling in that moment angry that they're not there with you. And then and as you express that, you might notice that you feel terribly sad that you're not going to be going on holiday. So you're looking forward to the hopes and dreams that you had that are now dashed. And so you can find some peace with expressing that. I was so looking forward to the time we were going to spend together, and I'm feeling sad. And that would be an example of a significant emotional statement, you know, being in touch with what it is that you've lost within the whole context of the death of your spouse. And then each of those feelings, just allowing them to be. And as you untangle this knot of conflicted feelings, you can notice that it's quite normal. There's nothing unusual about feeling conflicted. It would be very strange if we didn't have conflicted feelings, you know, because no relationship is absolutely perfect. And again, that's another element within the grief recovery process that we're really keen to emphasize. So as you're doing your graphs and looking for those highs and lows within the relationship, we're looking to see that there's always at least two things in the high and, you know, above the line, so to speak, and two things below. Because when we look back, it wouldn't be emotionally true to only remember the good things, to, you know, this kind of enshrinement of the dead. And, you know, I saw that a lot working with children who had died. You know, the child's bedroom is kept as a shrine almost, and no wrong can be said of the child. And yet probably in life, there were times when the parents were frustrated, or the child did something that they shouldn't have done, or, you know, so you have this warped recollection of what the relationship was. So by allowing for the conflicting feelings to be expressed, then you can allow for that space where maybe a mother whose child has died, and she can say, I felt very confused when I was pregnant, you know, and suddenly it's out there and it's okay. And, you know, even within the body, you can just feel so much release, knowing that it's okay to have these mixed emotions, and that some are positive and some are negative, and that's normal and okay.
Wow, that's so powerful. I bet that's, like, for some people, a really hard thing to do initially, like you say, because we tend to put people who are not here, particularly people who have died, on a pedestal. Or even in a relationship, we can be unhappy, but then it gets to, like, maybe a year after we've broken up, and then we start thinking, oh, but I remember this good thing and that good thing. You sort of end up remembering the good thing, don't you? And then you think, well, maybe we should try again. I mean, that's what I've been through recently. Should have done the grief recovery method on my marriage. I saved myself a year. But yeah, I see how that's.
Yeah, well, I think that's really insightful. To notice that doing this work when you're in the throes of grief can save you so much time. You know, I see that for myself looking back. And we often hear that you shouldn't start doing any kind of therapeutic grief work until a year or so has passed since someone has died. Within the grief recovery method, we say start as soon as you're ready. You know, someone can have died and you start the next day. You know, for me, I experienced a loss, which it was to do with my daughter and my identity as a mother. And so it wasn't a death, but it was nonetheless, I was absolutely in the throes of it when I started doing grief recovery work. I mean, I could barely speak for crying. I was in such a state of conflict and overwhelm. But because the grief recovery method is so clear, it's so simple, it allows you to just keep coming back to the heart. You can do it in whatever state. So, you know, in the throes of divorce, that is a good time to do this work.
I know, I should have done it. I think I'm on the other side of it now, just recently, but it has been 2 years of it. Sorry, I've got Kenny with me today. I'm just telling people who are watching because he's got a bad tummy. So anyway, we're going to be okay. But talking of, like, we talked about anger, which I, you know, I relate so much to what you were saying, because there was a time when my mum died, you know, and she died. We had time to say goodbye. She had breast cancer. She had a really good death, honestly. But there was a time, you know, this is 20 years ago now, that I remember thinking, like, she should have fought harder to live, you know, like, I need her. And I think that she could have, you know, she could have fought more. And I remember feeling angry. I didn't know then how normal that was. And I felt, like you say, very kind of like, gosh, I can't express that to anybody because she's not here to defend herself. I can't be kind of angry with her. So I just was wondering, like, with anger, is there anything that you would advise, like, on for how people could deal with their anger or express their anger?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. You know, we are terrible at handling anger, and anger, especially in relation to a death, is very confusing. So the first thing I'd say is just notice it, just allow it, just say to yourself, I'm feeling angry, and give space to it. And anger can mask other things. It can mask fear or sadness, or it can just be angry, you know, and however it manifests for you, just allow that. And that's a massive first step, just noticing I'm feeling angry. And then you could use one of those phrases like I was expressing earlier. So expressing it something like, when I think about your treatment, I feel angry that you didn't try harder. And then you can say, and I'm sorry, or I forgive you, or some other statement, you know, whatever feels emotionally true, authentic to you. You're not looking to say something right. There's no right. And I think that's another thing that's really, really important to emphasize. Everybody's relationship is unique. So that means everybody's grief is unique. You know, just because I've been through divorce doesn't mean to say that I know how you feel about your divorce.
Right. Yeah.
I can remember how I felt when I got divorced, and I can be present to how you feel, but I can't tell you how you feel because only you know that. And I think that's the same with anger. You know, recognizing that you're angry. And people might be saying, well, you shouldn't be angry. Of course she did her best. Or you shouldn't be angry because she didn't have any choice. Or you're only angry because, and giving some other reason. Nobody knows except you. So just allow yourself to have your feelings, to notice that you feel angry, and to find out what it is you want to express.
Yeah.
And if you can put it in that kind of phrasing, you know, when, and it could be that, say, for example, a father has died maybe 20 years ago and you're getting married, and for you, maybe it's important that he's there to give you away, and suddenly he's not. And of course, in a way, it's not suddenly because he's been dead for 20 years. But in this moment, you're feeling angry with him. And so within the grief recovery work, we always bring the relationships right up to date, because you can express, Dad, today I'm getting married and you're not here for me. And I'm feeling angry about that. And I forgive you. Or I'm sorry. You know, whatever the authentic emotion is for you, you know, you find a way of expressing it by being clear about what it is you feel and what it is you want to say, or what, you know, because we talk about forgiveness. And in this context, forgiveness is an action. You know, when you say, I forgive you, this is an action. And it takes it away from the head. Is it right? Were they wrong? You know, all these things. And you just drop down into the heart. I forgive you. And sometimes in certain situations, I forgive you is very difficult to say. And it feels at odds with what our culture says about things that have happened. So you can use the phrase, I forgive you so that I can be free. And forgiveness isn't condoning or condemning. So you're not saying, your dad is bad because he died and isn't there for you on your wedding day. There's no condemning. It's just that you're feeling angry. Today you're feeling angry and you forgive him for not being there so that you can be free.
Amazing answer. And thank you for answering so eloquently amidst my dog fidgeting around. Seems like he's gone downstairs, so that's good news. And another emotion that I just wanted to touch upon as well was guilt. And I don't know whether in the method you handle it similarly to anger, or what you could share about guilt, because I know that that's something that everybody struggles with.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we are riddled with guilt about everything. And the grief recovery method speaks to it in exactly the same way it does any other emotion. Notice it, just allow it to be present and to be okay with that. And then just gently tease it apart. What does the guilt comprise of? The example that you gave of perhaps being angry with your mum for not trying harder with her treatment, you might find that you then feel guilty that you didn't push her to do more, and so just looking at what is it that's contributing to this feeling of guilt, because we can be so consumed with the idea that we didn't do enough. I've lived with someone whose son died very suddenly, and he has gone over and over and over the day that he died. And should he have taken him to the doctor beforehand? Should he have done this? Should he have pushed for that? Should he? And it's so churning. You can imagine that constant churning, questioning and feeling I should have done more. So just to step back and notice where that guilt is arising, what's causing it. And it could be, I feel angry because you've gone, could be that. I feel helpless. When I saw you weren't breathing, I felt helpless and overwhelmed. So again, just going into that place, and it's a deep place. It's a place we're often afraid of. And we're all, we all operate within our kind of social roles. Mm-hmm. So for a father, it might be hard to be in touch with that part that wasn't able to be there for his son just because the circumstances were much greater. Mm-hmm. That might be very, very painful. And so we just invite that, just dropping into the heart, finding out what it is, being very, very kind, very gentle with yourself, and finding a way to express it. And, in that example, it could be, when I saw you weren't breathing and I tried to resuscitate you and you still didn't start breathing, I felt so helpless and so useless. And I want you to know that I'm sorry. And that brings very deep emotion. I can feel emotion arising in me, partly because I know the person, but I can also think of many people for whom this speaks to, that feeling of guilt because they weren't there or they didn't do something and they should have done something. And actually, it's really just letting go of that, letting go of the shoulds. Whenever there's a should, there's a little flag. Yeah. Do your grief work. Drop into the heart and find out what it is. And this is why it's so rich to work with someone else, because it can be frightening to go to that place alone. Mm-hmm. So this is why the grief recovery method is something you do in pairs. Even if you're not working with a specialist and you're working with a friend, you're still doing it with someone else. And they offer you that heart space to find that place of emotion, that place of authentic emotion. And once you've touched that place and found out what the incomplete communication is and expressed it, then comes healing. And it's very difficult in the mind to work out how that happens. And yet somehow it does. And because it's an action process, once you've taken the action, you experience the healing. And no matter how much thinking you do about how does that work or why does it work, it won't take you to that place. It has to come from action. It has to come from your authentic, aligned, heart-led action.
That's all such amazing stuff. Thank you, Rachel. We're coming to the end of the time, but I always like to ask each interviewee what their interpretation of conscious grief is.
Well, I think for me, it's learning the language of loss. I notice with my daughters, for example, that when perhaps they've been upset that a play date hasn't happened how they wanted, or to frame it in the language of loss, is teaching them in these very small steps, these early stages, how to identify where grief is arisen. So, you know, with a play date, for example, you could say, you know, you were hoping to have fun, or you were hoping to go out together and it didn't work, and now you're feeling sad about that. I think that's the first stage to conscious grief.
I love that. I love that. It's such a great question, because I hear, you know, so many different interpretations, and I think it's so true that so many of our upsets in life really is like, I mean, I remember interviewing Gary Rowe for the first series, and he said, you know, I think every issue is a grief issue. And I was like, it really, in a way, does come down to that with most things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I like to always say, sorry if I cut you off too soon, but if there's anything else that you'd like to share before we finish.
I just really want to encourage people to engage with the grief recovery method. It's simple, it's accessible, and it's incredibly healing on so many levels. And
your free gift to people is to have a complimentary session with yourself. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I would really like people to have the opportunity to experience the grief recovery method. So I'm offering one session with me, completely free.
That's so generous. Thank you so much, Rachel. And we will be putting a link to that underneath this interview. So yeah, it's just wonderful to really have this thorough understanding of the grief recovery method. And I thank you very, very much for coming and speaking for this series.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
Who's been watching. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.